Hello, students. Me again. Week 15 discussion questions. So this week is ironically and aptly about contingent labor, which is actually something that writing programs across the nation rely on, and pretty heavily. So if you're up on that news, some of this stuff might seem like, yeah, I get it. And if you're not up on that news, some of the articles should actually be pretty illuminating to you. So the Associations of Governing Boards article should be pretty interesting, which I had to provide a new link for, by the way. So make sure you click on the link from there as opposed to in the syllabus. Yeah. So the questions that I came up with are as follows. So from the position statement from NCTE, there's also most other big professional organizations for English teachers also have position statements that that deal with adjunct and contingent workforce. The NCTE one argues for long-term security of employment for writing instructors. How else could these large professional institutions help contingent faculty besides position statements? The 4Cs has a position statement. The WPA has position statement. I would imagine AWP, if you're a creative writer, has a position statement as well. And MLA does. In fact, I think MLA has started publishing a short journal on it. And all of these are really great. Are there other ways that these large professional institutions could help contingent faculty? And if so, what are they, and how do you think that could help? In the Kahn et al. Piece, they... this quote, "We recognize that the discourses around contingency tend towards one of the three sort: hollow but certainly well-intentioned exhortations, dramatic, often justifiably so, depictions of abuse, abusive exploitation, or a combined anger and despair. How could composition, rhetoric, and writing participate in different discourses around contingency, and what might these discourses look like and or do?" So what I'd like you to think about there is to think about all of the, we're kind of getting at the end of this semester, and we've read so much about the history of composition and rhetoric and its very high ideals to some of its not so high ideals. We've talked about assessment. Are there ways we could tell different stories about contingent faculties, different discourses? And if so, what might they look like? And what might they do? How might they work? Another question from that article, Kahn et al. Noticed that names matter. They say, a note on terminology, names matter, and many names exist for non-tenure track faculty, including lecturer, adjunct, temporary faculty, contingent faculty, and visiting professor. Have you ever held any of these titles? And if so, why? How did the name matter to you or those using it? So what I'm getting at there is asking you to think about the name and the use of the name and how that mattered to you or how those people using it. I could turn it on its head and say, tenured professor, like that name has a certain meaning and it matters to people who have it and who use that term. So if you've held this, how did it matter to you? The AGB article tells a sort of history of the social historical context that made colleges and universities rely on and continue exploit contingent faculty members in hiring. What strikes you as interesting here and why? And what does this report say about the state of higher ed and the teaching of writing in higher ed? So, especially for those of you who are onlookers, I would imagine this is pretty interesting. You could also touch on how that is complementary or contradictory to some of the K through 12 stuff. So if you know the sort of history, or maybe it aligns with some of the K through 12 education history, so from the Schnell article, she writes, given these conditions, a line I have found myself repeating in varied leadership roles as a former department chair, former WPA, and current university senator is this: we are in the battle for the soul of shared governance. We are in a battle for faculty members of all ranks to have a voice and an influence in matters of shared governance, and to steer the budgetary and intellectual future of our colleges and universities. We can no longer take it for granted in the neoliberal university that faculty members have the right to design and influence curricula, to exercise freedom, and to continue to guarantee access to higher education for students of all incomes and background. Many of us have learned the hard way that our university administrators are choosing to govern from the top down, and we cannot take shared governments for granted. So she's making a really strong case. And shared governments, if you don't know, has to do with voting in department meetings. Some contingent faculty members are able to vote in like faculty senate issues, raise issues with their faculty senate. Alternatively, not all contingent faculty can serve on faculty senate, but some of them can, and then you can have a voice on curriculum. Some departments have certain committees that contingent faculty can sit on. Like in my department, they have something called the Writing Programs Committee, and the WPA, the Writing Programs Administrator, is kind of the head of that committee, but they take a couple of representatives from each sort of rank and bring up policy positions and issues in there. So one of the things that we're discussing this week is we adopted a new learning management system, and we're discussing the university did, if there should be a policy in writing programs that specifically says that all writing teachers have to use this. And this is a variance from when I started teaching there 12 years ago, that most people by practice use the learning management system supported by the university, but others used a variation. And so that's something we're voting on in our writing programs committee, and it has become contentious in our writing programs committee, to say the least, with the sort of contingent faculty who just kind of don't want that enshrined in policy. They're fine making it a practice. So when I do the wrap up, I'll tell you how that went. But that's what I mean by shared governance. I don't know how much K through 12 educators have in the say of this stuff. I know that you have often a school board and you're able to talk, but I don't know on sort of granular levels if you have any shared governance. So the question that I'm asking for those of you who benefit by shared governance, either by proxy, you're either in a teaching environment that has this, even if you're not allowed a voice. What direct classroom impact has this had on you and your students? And for those of you who don't have shared governance, what direct classroom impact has this had on you and your students? So kind of, again, if you don't have this and you can imagine maybe we could have voted on that curriculum, or maybe we could have voted about adopting that technology, or maybe, on a board, these three people could have served and did X, Y, or Z to think about our students differently. Because I think Schnell makes the case that, this is a political act, political, not in the Washington politics thing, but to be on faculty shared governance committees, it means that we can show up for our students and for our fellow teaching colleagues, and we can also show up for ourselves. So moving on, John Warner, if you don't know, if you follow higher ed news, he writes a column called Just Visiting for Inside Higher Ed and has written it for a really long time. He often takes up the subject of writing, being a writing teacher, being a contingent faculty member, contingency issues, and then lately he's been taking up sort of the whole milieu of higher ed, so whether that be technology or assessment, and really kind of thinking of it from an institutional perspective. And he kind of takes the same ideas of Chanel as, the top-down thing isn't working for a lot of people, and you'll get that in his book. So you read parts 1 and 2. So the first question is, he goes after the 5-paragraph essay. And we have in this class, there's a lot of people in K through 12 education, and I was wondering what you would think about this book. So especially this first part where he goes after the 5-paragraph essay, which is something that you all have, some of you have talked kind of lovingly or like it's a useful thing. And so I wonder, after reading his take on the 5-paragraph essay, can you defend it? And I said, if so, spend some time doing that. And if you can't defend it, tell me what you found compelling about his argument. Finally, if you're in higher ed, what's your take on the 5-paragraph essay after reading Warner? Considering that, like, your students come to you, and not that, like, I wouldn't say it's a given that we don't teach 5-paragraph essays in higher ed, but we mostly don't teach 5-paragraph essays in higher ed. So sometimes we get students who come to us and they've written a lot of 5-paragraph essays, and we're saying, no, write a newspaper article or write an analysis, and they're just giving us 5-paragraph essays. And so what's your take on that? Finally, part 2 is called Other Necessities, and Warner mentions, the problem of atmosphere, the problem of surveillance, the problem of assessment and standardization, the problem of educational fads, the problem of technology hype, the problem of folklore, and the problem of precarity. Which one of these other necessities do you see having a big impact on your writing classroom and your students? Obviously, some of them might not directly impact them. It might be an idea that has floated down and has gotten into your school, and it's that kind of impact. So you don't have to say, like, this is a one-to-one impact. But where do you see this having an impact on your writing classroom and your students? And why do you think it's impacting your teaching situation? So kind of flesh out where that comes from. Like, for instance, if you have a certain assessment standard and you're talking about the ways that it impacts your classroom, like, how did you get there? Like, why do you think, maybe you can talk a little bit about how they adopted this assessment standard, and maybe it's really specific to your local school. Maybe it's your school bought a certain curriculum. Maybe it's, this is something the federal government level and has trickled down. So, those are my questions, and I'm really excited to see the way that you all answer these and kind of work on that. So thank you.